When Senator Ron Wyden stepped onto the Senate floor and called out Pam Bondi by name, the room shifted. You could feel it. It was the kind of moment that doesn't happen unless something serious is being hidden. And the way Wyden said it, calm, controlled, but edged with the kind of frustration only built over years of stonewalled investigations, was enough to make even seasoned lawmakers stop what they were doing and listen. Because when a senator publicly challenges the nation's chief law officer and asks why she's blocking access to a billion-dollar trail connected to one of the darkest criminal networks in modern memory, you know this story is far bigger than anyone wants to admit.
From Oregon.
Mr. President, Donald Trump has made some far-fetched statements over the last few months, but a stunner in the last few days was his claim that the Jeffrey Epstein matter was a hoax and a scam. Here is why the president is wrong. The figure at the center of this story was an ultra-rich, well-connected sex trafficker. He was a serial rapist of women and young girls. And for some reason, the Trump administration, that claimed they'd be the most transparent administration ever, turned on a dime. The president had run on a campaign with a promise to expose the Epstein files. Now he and the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, say, nope, nothing to investigate. When it comes to Epstein and sex trafficking, all these claims are just ludicrous. I want the American people to know that that's wrong. If you want to know why, just look at the latest report from our investigators that was discussed in the New York Times this morning. Now, somewhere in the Treasury Department, Mr. President, locked away in a cabinet drawer, is a big Epstein file that's full of actionable information. Follow the money details about his financing and operations that await investigation. Last year, the Biden administration allowed our investigators to look at portions of the file. We did that at the Treasury building. Here is what it says. Treasury's Epstein file details, Mr. President, 4,725 wire transfers. Let me repeat that. 4,725 wire transfers, adding up to nearly $1.1 billion flowing in and out of just one of Mr. Epstein's bank accounts. If you ask me, that is more than 4,000 potential lines of investigation right there. Hundreds of millions more flowed through other accounts. That's even a lot more to investigate. The file shows that Mr. Epstein used multiple Russian banks, which are now under sanctions, to process payments related to sex trafficking. A lot of the women and girls he targeted came from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, and elsewhere. One shudders to think about the kinds of people who must have been involved in trafficking these women and young girls out of those companies and into the Epstein web of abuse. Again, these are all potential leads, Mr. President, the Department of Justice ought to be digging into. This is about years and years of international sex trafficking. None of this is a hoax. None of it is a scam. And I'd like to say I consider it insulting to the intelligence of the American people for the Trump administration to simply say there is nothing to investigate here. Now, when the Trump administration came in with a lot of fanfare about transparency and openness, I said, I'm going to follow up on that. So I wrote to the Attorney General, Ms. Bondi, Treasury Secretary Bessent, FBI Director Patel, and I asked them all to produce the Epstein file to the Senate Finance Committee so it could be reviewed. In fact, I've made that request multiple times. The Trump commitment to transparency based on the response didn't mean a whole lot because they just refused. Here's what one Treasury official wrote back to me. I'll quote here. The Department of Treasury has previously made documents available relating to the matter in response to your inquiries. Accordingly, we understand that you have the information you seek from the Treasury related to this request. We thank you for your attention to this important issue. Mr. President, for anybody who's familiar with how these discussions go in Washington, D.C., what I just read was code for the bureaucracy saying, you're asking for information, go pound sand. The Trump administration may be trying to close the books on the Epstein sex trafficking, but I want it understood as a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee, where we spend a lot of time looking at where substantial sums of money are going, particularly if they may be promoting wrongdoing and helping to evade taxes. We are going to stay on this fight to hold the wealthy individuals accountable for the harm that they clearly were involved in injuring the young women and others in this sex trafficking. So I'm going to have more follow-up for Attorney General Bondi very quickly. As for today, Mr. President, if she doesn't want to do the investigating, doesn't want the DOJ to do it, let me just restate my original demand. Have that Treasury information given to the Senate Finance Committee and have us on a bipartisan basis do our work. That's what we do in important investigations. If the Trump people believe they need additional authority to carry out the requests that I make again this afternoon, let me offer to help them write the bill myself. The idea that there is nothing more to investigate, not when you have 4,000 wire transfers, many of them associated with the possibility of wrongdoing and sex traffic promoting. The idea that you have that and there's nothing to investigate when it comes to the Epstein sex trafficking operation is ridiculous. Pam Bondi was the Attorney General in the state of Florida, where a lot of the Epstein crimes were committed. The Attorney General ought to know better, of all people. Mr. President, I can't begin to understand the President's handling of this or why he thinks this is just going to go away. But I'm here to say that our investigators have spent 3 full years looking into this. And the reason why is because we feel so strongly about the horror of sex trafficking and our commitment to root it out. The President of the Senate is new to this body, but I'm sure he's dealt with these issues before. You can't have a much bigger horror in front of you than sex trafficking abuse. So we're talking about real evil done to women and girls by Jeffrey Epstein. And Mr. President, nobody gets to sweep that under the rug. I yield the floor.
Wyden didn't start with drama. He started with numbers. Numbers so staggering that even people accustomed to reading financial crime reports had to blink twice. He described a Treasury file that very few people in government have ever seen, a file locked inside a cabinet, containing thousands of wire transfers tied to one account alone, for 1,725 transfers, nearly $1.1 billion. flowing through a network that investigators believe was used to support and conceal a system built on exploitation. And right when he said those words, nearly $1.1 billion, he paused. Not for effect, but because the weight of that number carries its own gravity. Then he asked the question the public has been asking quietly for years. Why is Pam Bondi refusing to let the Senate see the full records? The way Wyden told it, investigators were allowed to look at a fraction of the file during the prior administration. A small sliver. Enough to confirm that this wasn't some scattered collection of financial noise, but a carefully engineered structure stretching across multiple countries and banking systems. Enough to show that some transfers went through Russian institutions, including banks now under sanctions. Enough to raise questions, not conclusions, but serious questions about who was involved, who facilitated the money movements, and who may have looked the other way. But then, access was cut off. Doors closed. Requests rejected. And that's where Pam Bondi enters the story in full force. Wyden explained that he had sent formal letters to her office. Not once, not twice, multiple times. Each request was simple. Release the Treasury information to the Senate Finance Committee, the committee legally responsible for reviewing these kinds of financial irregularities. Instead of cooperation, the response from the agencies under Bondi's authority was a carefully worded brush-off that people in Washington instantly recognized. It was bureaucratic code for, "Stop asking." A senior Treasury official even wrote that Wyden already had the information he needed, which wasn't true. He had only been shown a portion, a preview, a fragment of a much larger puzzle. But what made this moment even more striking was Wyden's reminder that Bondi once held power in a state where many of these crimes originally occurred. She had context. She had history with the case. If anything, she was positioned to push harder for full transparency. Instead, she was the one refusing to release the very files that could expose the extent of the financial network behind the operation. And that contradiction has fueled years of public suspicion. Now, to be clear, some of what circulates online about this secrecy is speculation. Rumors suggest that the locked Treasury file may contain names of financial intermediaries whose roles were never publicly disclosed. Others claim the records could point toward institutions that process transactions without asking questions. None of that is proven. But secrecy breeds speculation, especially when the stakes are this high, and when information is withheld despite repeated lawful requests. Wyden didn't rely on whispers or rumors. He focused on what is documented. Nearly $1 billion in just one account. Hundreds of millions more through others. Transfers involving foreign banks. Movement patterns often associated with concealed networks. And a DOJ under Bondi that refuses to release the data. These aren't guesses. They're facts on paper. Facts locked away behind a wall of institutional silence. What makes the financial picture so disturbing isn't only the volume of money. It's the human reality behind it. Wyden emphasized that many of the victims came from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, and other countries where vulnerable young women can be manipulated by traffickers with promises of work or education. Each transfer isn't just a number in a ledger. It's a trail connected to real lives, girls and young women whose suffering became the fuel for an international operation. And when you hear the scale of the transfers, you understand that this wasn't some isolated criminal working alone. This was a system. A pipeline, a network that required organization, funding, and coordination. Wyden pointed out that his investigators spent 3 years trying to trace these networks. 3 years of requesting access, reviewing partial files, and being turned away from the full truth. He described how the Senate Finance Committee has the legal authority and the responsibility to examine financial flows tied to potential illegal activity. But that responsibility becomes meaningless when the very agencies tasked with transparency refuse to comply. The most chilling part of Wyden's speech was when he described the Treasury file as actionable. Not informational, not historical, actionable. Meaning, the records contain clear indicators that point toward individuals, banks, entities, and connections that could still be investigated today. Leads that could expose accomplices. Leads that could show who financially benefited. Leads that could reveal whether others helped facilitate the movement of victims across borders. And if those leads remain buried, accountability disappears with them. Bondi's refusal to release the file took on a heavier meaning as Wyden continued speaking. He questioned why anyone would block Congress from reviewing evidence tied to one of the most notorious criminal networks in modern history. He didn't accuse her of motive. He didn't speculate about her intentions. He simply asked the question that every viewer would be asking. What possible justification could exist for withholding thousands of financial records connected to an international trafficking operation? The response her agencies gave, that Wyden already had everything he needed, made even less sense when contrasted with the sheer size of the financial activity described. For 1,725 wire transfers. Not 10, not 50, nearly 5,000. Each one a potential link to wrongdoing. Each one a doorway into uncovering the mechanics of the network. No trained investigator would ever claim that reviewing a fraction of that data equates to having the full picture. That Wyden's frustration wasn't political. It was moral. He spoke about the survivors, women who endured horrors that should never happen in a civilized society. He stressed that these victims deserve justice, not stonewalling. And he made it clear that anyone who tries to bury evidence is prolonging the suffering of the people who lived through the worst of this. When he said, "Nobody gets to sweep this under the rug," it wasn't a line for the cameras. It was a statement of responsibility. As Wyden laid out the facts, the broader implications became clear. This isn't just about one file. It's about how power can shield information that should be public. It's about how financial crimes can be hidden behind layers of bureaucracy. It's about how survivors can wait years for closure while institutions argue over access. And it's about why secrecy around a case this significant raises questions that won't go away, no matter how tightly someone tries to lock them behind a cabinet door. There are analysts who believe the withheld Treasury information could reshape the public understanding of the entire network. Some suggest the transfers may reveal patterns of coordinated financial support from individuals or entities not yet publicly connected to the case. Again, these claims are unverified, but they persist because the facts we do know are so extraordinary that silence feels unnatural. People don't hide harmless information. They hide explosive information. Wyden ended his remarks with a challenge. If the DOJ doesn't want to investigate, he said, then release the files and let Congress do it. Let lawmakers follow every transfer, every link, every clue that has been gathering dust inside that cabinet. He even offered to help draft the legislation needed to authorize access. That's how urgently he views the situation. When a senator volunteers to write a bill on the spot just to obtain records, you know someone has hit a wall built by more than simple disorganization. And that brings the story to its unavoidable conclusion. Whatever is in that Treasury file, someone does not want it seen. Not piecemeal, not summarized, not redacted. Seen. Fully. Openly. And until it is, speculation will continue, questions will multiply, and trust in the system will erode. Because this isn't just a financial mystery. It's a story about accountability, about truth, about a network of exploitation that victimized countless young women, and about the officials who now hold the keys to the records that could reveal the full scope of what happened. The public doesn't need gossip. It needs answers. And Wyden's speech made it clear that those answers are sitting in a file, locked away, waiting for someone with enough courage or enough pressure to finally open it. That if you believe these records should be released, if you believe transparency matters, if you believe survivors deserve more than silence, then stay with this channel. Subscribe, hit the like button, drop a comment, and share this video. The more people who demand answers, the harder it becomes for anyone to hide the truth. Your voice matters. Your attention matters. And together, we can keep pushing until the full story finally comes to light.